when there's really big growth, we expect that to feel amazing. But to our nervous systems, it actually feels very unsafe because if growth happens too fast, we almost don't have the capacity to hold all of it. And so, because it feels like way more than we could hold, the way our nervous system tries to protect us is kind of by what feels like sabotage of like, this is too much, do less.
Yeah.
And it's almost like it holds us back. We start doing less, we start making less money, but not because your nervous system doesn't want you to grow. It's just, it couldn't hold as much as you were achieving, which is why like very fast growth could be a little dangerous.
Hey, welcome back to Imperfect Action. This is episode 723 in a day. I'm bringing in a guest to chat about a couple of the things that I know are holding you back from growing your business, keeping you stuck at the level that you are at. And that might look like procrastination. It might be overworking. It might be these behaviors that we tend to refer to as self-sabotaging behaviors. And today's guest, Masha Kay, is a nervous system and breathwork coach. Her big, secret sauce is how you can use that nervous system regulation to break through the plateaus in your business, to get yourself unstuck, to overcome the procrastination, the overworking, all of the things, the busy that keeps us at the level we are at in our businesses. Now, without further ado, let's jump into the chat with Masha. Masha, welcome to Imperfect Action. I'm so excited to have you here. And as I was saying before we hit record, I feel like I've already learnt a lot from you, not so much in a business context, but especially around like all of this nervous system regulation that you really are an expert in. And I want to kick this interview off by asking you, how did you get into nervous system regulation? Because it's not really something that when you're a kid, you're like, when I grow up, I want to be a nervous system coach and breathwork coach.
100%. So first of all, I'm so excited to be here. I'm so honored to be here. I feel like your content is just so relevant to where I was a few years ago. And, a lot of things, honestly, I started following you are still relevant now. So I'm just so excited to be chatting with you. But you're absolutely right. I don't think anyone sets out to be a nervous system and breathwork coach. And it's kind of interesting. I came here in a very roundabout way, to be honest with you. My background is actually not in this at all. My background is in actuarial science and economics. So that's where I started my career. I pretty much would say it's 180 degree difference from where I am right now. So that's where I started my career. I was kind of like a typical overachiever, just like always doing the right thing. And that's felt like a very stable career choice. That felt like the right career choice. I was good in math, like just seemed like the obvious choice. And then 2 years into that, I was so miserable. I was good at taking the math exams because I loved math, but like there was just lack of fulfillment. And so I kind of had my own quarter life crisis. And I didn't really know what other skills or gifts or talents I had at that point. So I'm like, okay, I can't change jobs, but I could just focus on myself, right? I could just find ways to make myself feel better in terms of focusing on my physical health. And, I did that. I started eating differently and exercising. Like, okay, now mental health. And, I started learning about like reframing, okay, emotional health. And so I kind of went down this rabbit hole of healing and self-improvement and taking courses and getting certified truly just for myself, just to understand if I can't change jobs, how can I get myself to feel better? And somewhere down the lines, a few years into that, I was like, wait, I really love doing this. I've actually tutored since early high school. So I always loved teaching. And I was like, maybe I could help other people with this journey. I kind of have a unique perspective. And so that kind of got me into coaching. But I started out as a holistic health coach. I was just really interested in the mind, the body, the connection between the two. And so that's what I started doing. And then at some point, I decided to leave my corporate job, start my business. And then that's when it got really hard because it's like, okay, you have the information, you have the desire, I thought I set myself up well, but it was just so overwhelming. And so I started looking for more tools that were like a little more business oriented, just like whatever I can grasp to. And somewhere down the line, I took a workshop around the nervous system. And when I learned about it, I'm like, oh, that's what's happening right now. I'm getting super dysregulated because there's just such a lack of stability, right? All the things that I use to comfort myself as like coping mechanisms, my overachieving, my job, success, None of that is accessible to me. Kind of feel like I'm making mistakes and failing left and right, was super triggering. And so that's when I learned about the nervous system, and I basically just started applying it to myself to help me kind of move forward in my coaching business. And then as I started working with clients over and over, I would be telling them what to do. And a lot of the times they knew what to do, but they're like, I can't do it. What's wrong with me? And I would have to explain, oh, that's your nervous system, right? Like I can completely explain that. And I just realized so much of my coaching is really about that. That has to be the foundation. A lot of us know the right things to do. We just don't know how to do them because our nervous system gets in the way.
Oh, there is so much to unpack in that. But I think I want to start with, how does your nervous system, what are some of the ways that your nervous system can impact how you show up in your business?
Oh my gosh, where to begin? It could honestly impact every area of how you show up in your business, truly. Because if you think about it, we're talking about your nervous system. Your nervous system has these three states. Without going into detail, one state is the state of safety, where you feel relatively safe. And then there's two states of feeling dysregulated, where your nervous system doesn't believe you are safe. And so it acts in all these different ways. And the cool thing, and kind of the scary thing, is that when it feels unsafe, every system of your body mobilizes, right? So your vision changes, your saliva changes, your digestion changes, the way your brain works changes, muscle flow, breath, heart, you name it, it all changes, right? And so the way this could show up in your business, like there's countless ways, but for some people, you become more busy. It feels like it's constantly not enough. I constantly need to be doing more, constantly filling up your schedule, constantly feeling like I need to be shaming and blaming myself, or I need to be blaming and shaming other people, right? So we call this the sympathetic state. And that's kind of like the fight or flight response, right? And really it's just your nervous system is trying to keep you safe by mobilizing. And it's doing all of these things. But the problem is, in this state, your prefrontal cortex, which is the part of your brain just responsible for executive functioning, so all the functioning you need to run your business, long-term decision making, creativity, planning, strategizing, it starts to go dark. And so you start doing, but you're doing in random directions. So you're very, very busy and you're doing a lot and you're pointing fingers at yourself or others, but there's no long-term vision there, really. You lose sight of that. So that's kind of like one category. And there's a lot in there that we could like break down into details. And then there's the other group where people who just shut down, right? And that's your nervous system protecting by immobilizing, right? So one way it's staying safe by taking action, and another way tries to stay safe by taking no action, kind of like playing dead, right? And so this could look a lot like procrastination. It could look like perfectionism. Like if it's not perfect, I can't really put it out. It could look like just disconnection, just disassociating, numbing, not doing anything, suddenly feeling like I'm so lazy. What's wrong with me? Getting really hard on yourself. So just like shaming yourself. If before you're just being hard on yourself to motivate yourself, here you're just kind of like constantly putting yourself down, feeling really hopeless. And the interesting thing is like we go into these states based on how our nervous system interprets our environment. So there might not really be anything happening in your outside world, in your office, but your nervous system could be going into a different state. And that state puts this different filter on the world. So it's almost like reality becomes incredibly distorted, meaning your business becomes incredibly distorted. The way you see your business becomes incredibly distorted.
Oh, that makes so much sense. And as you were talking about those two states, I can see myself in past experiences in both of those different states. I'm really curious, like in your experience, what can trigger the two different states? And is it a case of different triggers would trigger you to mobilize versus shut down? Or is it like a person by person kind of basis?
Yeah, that's a really great question. That's a really good question. So there's like kind of two parts to this question, right? Like the first part is there are some things that we all have in common that trigger our nervous systems, right? So specifically, our nervous systems interpret change, uncertainty, and isolation as danger across the board. And I find that really fascinating. And I wonder if this was your experience too, or the people that you work with. Like when I started working for myself, all three change, uncertainty, and isolation. Like suddenly I'm barely seeing anybody. I'm just alone in my apartment. Suddenly there's complete uncertainty. I was never had instability in income or anything like that. I knew exactly what I wanted to do up until that point. and just constant change. Like, I think I'm going to do this and then I have to do something else. So those things for me were just incredibly triggering, but they're like
Yeah.
across the board.
Oh yes, I think about the biggest, like the moment where my business grew so quickly. It felt like it was overnight. There was a huge amount of change. It happened right at the start of the pandemic. So there was a lot of
Wow.
uncertainty. And I lived by myself at the time as we were going into lockdown. So the isolation, that was like the triple whammy.
The triple whammy. What was that like for you?
It
So
was,
did you feel like you were shutting down, or did you
yeah,
feel like you were just getting like really busy?
it was a shutdown. Like I remember so clearly, I was like, my business is taking off. I know what I need to do, but I'm sitting here and I literally cannot do anything. That was what it felt
Yeah.
like.
Oh my gosh, yeah. And that same, like when I started my business, that's exactly what it felt like. And I don't know about for you, but for me, that was just a very unfamiliar feeling because
Yeah.
before I was like, I saw myself as like kind of like a doer, like an overachiever, like just do, do, do. And that was the first time like, oh, I can't do anything. And I don't know what it is. And so that makes a lot of sense. And so there's those things, right? And that's for everyone across the board, which is why I think like owning your own business is so triggering. But then there's also triggers that are individual to you, right? Like I always say that our nervous system is customized to our lived experience. So, for example, if we were out in the wild and you were walking through the wild and there was a tiger and you first heard the bushes kind of rustle and then the tiger jumped out, right? Your nervous system would remember anytime you hear that sound of the bushes, start running, right? And that's how it would keep you safe in the future so you wouldn't die. And that's still true. So to this day, it could be like 10 years later, you could have been in the middle of Manhattan and you heard something in the bushes and you would start running. It wouldn't logically make sense, but your nervous system was wired to keep you safe, right? And so that's still true. So if we've had certain experiences in our childhood, growing up with other people around ownership, anything, if we had certain painful experiences, our nervous system remembers. And then anytime in the future, anything looks kind of sort of familiar, feels kind of sort of familiar to that, our nervous systems will respond in the way we responded then, even though it's not really appropriate now, right? It's kind of like it projects the past onto the present. And I think like with your own business, what often happens, it's so personal that your nervous system is projecting things that happen with your parents, with caregivers, with school, with friends onto your business, even though that your business is not those people, but it feels like it is.
Oh, that makes so much sense. Like as you're talking, my brain's just like connecting all of these different dots. So, I mean, we talked about like surface level, you're either shutting down or you're mobilizing. What are some other signs that you might not be regulated?
Yeah. So let's see. So, like, again, we can kind of think about it in these two categories, right? I think one big one, maybe this feels obvious, maybe it isn't, is very intense emotional responses,
Mm.
right? So, when stressors happened, if it feels like very intense, like the world is ending, like this is everything, like you get this like tunnel vision feeling, that's a sign that you're getting dysregulated, right? Sometimes it could feel like our reactions are disproportionate and we can't quite tell why. That's a sign that there's some dysregulation happening, that your nervous system is thinking what's happening now is actually what happened in the past. And there's way more danger than is actually present, right? It could also manifest as like physical sensations. I think people don't realize that when we get dysregulated, our immune system shuts down, our digestion starts to shut down, our reproductive organs start to shut down. So that's another sign of like chronic dysregulation, right? A lot of people have gut issues. There's often a connection there. If you're constantly like, I'll have clients who tend to like hustle and then burn out, and they will notice they will get sick at the end of like that hustle period, right? And it's like that's very connected because it's connected to your immune system. Um, Feeling, triggered by other people, sometimes feeling like the world is against you, or, taking things a little bit more personally. That also could be a sign of dysregulation because when we're dysregulated, we actually are not able to connect. We go into a state of protection, which is the opposite of connection.
Mm.
And so feeling connected to others becomes really hard. And, interacting with others becomes more difficult. Um, Perfectionism, like, is an easy one, but I think sometimes people think, oh, that's a personality trait. Like, I'm just a perfectionist. It's like, no, that's actually a sign of dysregulation.
Is it always a sign of dysregulation, or like, because I can imagine somebody's listening to this and they're like, no, but like for me, it really is just a personality trait.
It's a tough one. I would argue that it is a sign of dysregulation, and maybe it's a little more complicated in that it's a trauma response, right? So perfectionism across the board is how you learn to keep yourself safe. Probably at some point you didn't feel good enough, and making sure everything around you is perfect, making sure you're perfect, making sure you show up perfectly became a way to kind of cover up those feelings of shame, to protect yourself. Right. And so now, as you're going through life, or like you're moving through your business and things are getting really stressful, that's the protective mechanism that comes up. It's like, oh, that worked for us in the past. We better do that now. And so, kind of also thinking, I think the people who would argue, no, it's a personality trait, sometimes confuse healthy striving and perfectionism.
Yeah. Okay. And what about procrastination? Because I know this one also, I'm a procrastinator. Like that can be a personality trait as well. Is that similar to perfectionism in this case?
Yes, very similar. And I think procrastination is an interesting one, because I think with procrastination, there's just so much shame, right? So when we make that a part of our identity, perfectionist, there could be like a little bit of like a humble brag to it, right? It's like, oh, my worst quality is I'm a perfectionist. I do things really, really well, right? And so it's not the best, but there's a little bit of like pride associated with it sometimes, right? But procrastination, there's usually a lot of shame of like, I'm just not someone who can follow through on things. I'm just not someone who's capable of that. And none of that is actually true. So what procrastination is actually is your nervous system is kind of doing the math. And that thing that you're procrastinating is probably one that's to some degree painful. Maybe when you're doing it, you kind of feel like a failure. Maybe it's really hard for you. Maybe it forces you to face certain insecurities you have, right? And so your nervous system is like, I don't want to do that. That hurts me. And so procrastination is your nervous system's way of keeping you away from the pain, right? Because your nervous system is just concerned with the short term. And so in the short term, if it could just put off that thing, then it's keeping you safe. It's keeping you away from that discomfort. And so that's actually all that it is. And so it's definitely not a personality trait. It's very much how you keep yourself safe, because I can bet you're not procrastinating the things that feel really easy to you. You're procrastinating the things that are hard, that challenge you, that make you feel maybe a little insecure. And that's actually your nervous system just trying to keep you safe.
Oof, yeah, that resonates so much. Like, as somebody who does tend to procrastinate a lot, as you're saying that, I'm like, yeah, the things that I procrastinate are the things that feel really uncomfortable or feel difficult to start, or I feel a little bit unclear or uncertain because I don't know what I need to do to succeed in that. So that really, yeah, that makes so much sense. I'm curious to know, like, what are some of the mistakes that you see other business owners making that keep them in this trap of being dysregulated?
Whew, that's a good question. Let me think about that. I mean, I guess the first one that comes to mind is the busyness, right? I would say that's a major one. And it's kind of like a chicken or the egg situation, right? Is it the busyness that creates the dysregulation, or did the dysregulation create the busyness? And it's often some combination, right? So often you'll use busyness to like make yourself feel productive. Like, I just want to check things off my to-do list. I just need to fill up my time, fill up my day. But then that leads you to not having time to kind of think more strategically and do the things that really matter. And then it leads you to feeling really burnt out. And then that burnout creates more dysregulation, right? So I think like that's one really big thing. I think another thing that often, you know, I don't know if this is something business owners are doing. I don't think this is wrong, but I think this is something that creates dysregulation for a lot of people. And I think we really need to teach business owners to regulate through this. It's the lack of stability in their businesses, right? In general, if you're becoming a business owner, there's a lot less stability, right? And I think we don't consider how dysregulating that could be. And so we're not thinking about that. We're not thinking, okay, how do I create stability? How do I make myself feel safe? And we're kind of like, oh, I'll just figure it out. And to some degree, that is good. You kind of just got to throw yourself in sometimes, start taking action. But you need to kind of be working with your nervous system, not just ignoring it and being like, no, it will get better once I'm making more money or something like that. So it's almost like not accounting for the fact that your business will dysregulate you. And you almost need to be prepared for that and start taking action in preparation for that. Like that almost needs, in my opinion, needs to be like a foundational component of creating a business.
And what kind of action can we take to prepare for that?
So I think the first part is just being aware of what your nervous system is, what these states are, and starting to build out a toolkit for what are the things that give safety to your nervous system? What are the tools that you can use? And so it's the toolkit. So like understanding the nervous system, building out a toolkit, understanding like when I get dysregulated, what do I do? How do I know the differences between the sympathetic state versus that shut down dorsal state? Right? Because I would take different steps in each one. So kind of like that understanding and starting to build out that toolkit, I think is one piece. And the second piece, I think, is kind of like what are the routines and daily actions that I take to create some structure and stability for myself. So maybe finances aren't going to be stable, but we can create stability through the way we structure our day. We can create stability maybe by using a tool like breathwork or journaling, or whatever resonates with you and is appropriate to your nervous system, as something we do every day and having routines and rituals around that. So I think that's a really big one. Of course, community and connection, that's a huge one for our nervous systems as well. So yeah, I would say those kind of two separate categories, the things you do daily to create stability and structure, which includes community and routines and rituals. And then kind of building out a toolkit for when your nervous system does get a little dysregulated, what are the tools you have? What are the tools that work? How do you kind of make it easy for yourself to reach for something versus getting dysregulated? And when it feels like the world is on fire, expecting yourself to like go and find or learn some kind of tool, which is just, it's not accessible, right? It's almost like too late at that point.
But I'm also thinking like when I've been in those kinds of moments where it feels like everything's, either I just want to like hide and do nothing or I want to do everything. It's easy when you're not in those moments to be like, oh yeah, the next time that happens, I will get my journal out and I'll journal my way through it. But when you're in that moment, like it doesn't feel possible or you don't think about it or you don't catch yourself. Do you have any tips on how you can start to notice those moments and change the way you react to them?
Yes, absolutely. So again, to me, it comes down to one, can you start making time outside of those moments to start to understand your nervous system a little bit? Maybe start using those tools. So let's say you say, like, I want to journal next time I'm really stressed, right? But you never journal outside of that. To expect yourself to lean towards that is going to be impossible. So maybe it's creating a ritual around that when you are feeling relatively regulated, something you do every day. So just kind of like the intention is there. But then it's also learning to kind of like practicing mindfulness, really, learning to befriend yourself and your nervous system. And so in those moments of dysregulation, noticing them and just getting curious about them, kind of like the way a scientist would. And I say that very intentionally because I think what a lot of us do when we're in that moment is we shame ourselves. We're like, oh, I can't believe I'm here. I can't, I'm never going to get out of this. What's wrong with me? I shouldn't be here. What do I do to get out? And there's like this panic to get out of it. Instead of just approaching it from a more neutral, like, let me observe. What does this feel like in my body? What are my behaviors? Like, again, just like imagining you're a scientist observing yourself in a laboratory and getting genuinely curious about what is going on here. And that mindfulness is kind of step one to being like, okay, now that I'm observing it, what actions do I want to take? And honestly, it takes a little bit of like, that part sounds so easy in theory, but it actually takes so much practice and repetition to consistently practice that mindfulness and become the observer, and to not do that from a place of shame, which is what most of us do, right? We like shame ourselves when we're in it, or we just completely ignore it and we're like, whatever, it is what it is. This is just my personality. There's no better way. right? And we kind of just allow those behaviors to just keep happening over and over and over again. And in that way, it starts to feel like we're sabotaging ourselves. Like, I hate that word because I actually think it's self protection, but it starts to feel like we are sabotaging ourselves.
And I know, like, for sure, that's something whenever I talk to my audience, whenever I talk to my students in my courses, that's something that comes up over and over again. It's like, why am I self-sabotaging? Why am I procrastinating this thing that I know I need to do because it's going to move my business forward? And there is so much shame around that. And then they end up feeling really even worse about themselves.
Yes, exactly. And you're right. It's like that self sabotage and the shame we have around that is such a huge part of this. And I guess like a couple of things I would say is it's not self sabotage. It's actually self protection. And I find that to be like a helpful, very minor shift that we could make when we're in those moments, that your nervous system is not trying to ruin your day or ruin your business, right? Your nervous system is concerned with keeping you safe. It doesn't care about money. It doesn't care about growth. It doesn't even care about your health. It just cares about you surviving another moment, you being okay in this exact moment, right? So we're not sabotaging, we're trying to protect ourselves, but maybe we're protecting ourselves in ways that don't align with our business, right?
Mm.
And in those moments, I really encourage people to think about, you know, maybe my nervous system has a point here. Not that I should quit my business altogether and stop, but maybe something here doesn't feel safe. Maybe it's kind of giving me a clue that something here doesn't feel good to me. And instead of seeing my nervous system and myself as the enemy, which is like what we do when we think like self-sabotage,
Mm.
it's thinking about how is it actually an ally? It's an ally that's trying to protect me. So what is it doing? And how do I start to see that and work with it?
Is that always a sign though that it's that you're on the wrong path? Like, let's say that you are pushing yourself to do something that feels scary and you find yourself procrastinating it or not wanting to do the thing. And you're like, oh, is this because it's a bad decision or is it because it's unfamiliar? Like, how do we know the difference between the two?
Yes, that's such a great question. The answer is no. The short answer is absolutely no. But I completely understand what you're saying. And like one way I explain that is, growth and safety are kind of opposing forces,
Mm.
right? In order to grow, you need to step out of your comfort zone. In order to stay safe, you need to stay in your comfort zone,
Yeah.
right? And so your nervous system is kind of always battling against the part of you that wants to grow. And so you're absolutely right. When we start taking actions towards our dreams and goals, we're going to start self sabotaging. I think a lot of people think, oh, this must mean I'm on the wrong path. And it means no such thing. And like one of like my pet peeves is kind of, I think a lot in the self help space, there is like this like, oh, if it's not a yes, it's a no. And I could just not agree with that any less, because the truth is, even the things that are meant for you and are right for you are going to feel very uncomfortable to your nervous system. And to get back to your question, like, well, what do you do about this? It's not that we need to change directions. It's more about thinking like in this moment, how do I make this step a little less scary, right? My nervous system is basically telling me this thing that you're doing feels too overwhelming. It's not the wrong thing. It just feels too overwhelming. The step feels too big. And so that's actually why I love the name of your podcast, because I think in those moments, it's about taking smaller steps that are imperfect.
Yeah.
Right. So thinking about how could I just in this moment, how do I can bring some safety to my nervous system? There's amazing tools you can do. You can reach out for connection. You can reach out for support. Right. So how do I bring safety? And if I do want to move towards, that step that I originally set out for myself, can I make it a little smaller? Can I make it a little more imperfect? How do I make it feel a little bit more doable to my nervous system?
I love that. And it's such an interesting way. Like, I wish I'd known this 3 years ago when my business grew so quickly. It's like I would have realized that it was just all my nervous system trying to keep me safe. It wasn't self-sabotage. It wasn't anything to be ashamed of, this shutting down, this not wanting to do the things that I knew I needed to do. So thank you so much for sharing that. I
Yeah.
know that's going to help my listeners big time, big time. Oh,
And I will say, if I could just add one thing to that, of like your example, I think is a really interesting one, which is like when there's really big growth, we expect that to feel amazing. But
mm,
to our nervous systems, it actually feels very unsafe because if growth happens too fast, we almost don't have the capacity to hold all of it. And so, because it feels like way more than we could hold, the way our nervous system tries to protect us is kind of by what feels like sabotage of like, this is too much, do less.
yeah.
And it's almost like it does, it holds us back. We start doing less, we start making less money, but not because your nervous system doesn't want you to grow. It's just, it couldn't hold as much as you were achieving, which is why like very fast growth could be a little dangerous.
Yeah, that makes so much sense. And like, I can think, even as you're saying that, I can think of times when I've quote unquote self sabotaged opportunities to speak at events or collaborate with somebody who was like a dream collaboration because that felt really uncomfortable. So it's like not just like, I guess, financial growth or like growth as how we typically define it in business.
Exactly, exactly. And like, think about it, all like the growth. We think of stress as only the bad thing, but stress is also good things. Like opportunities are so stressful. They might be like amazing and you might be so grateful for them, but they're stressful, right? And so your nervous system, it's really kind of the part of you that decides how much stress you could handle. That's what it does. It decides how much stress you could handle. And so, if you haven't expanded your nervous system's capacity to handle more stress, but more stressful things are happening, your nervous system's like, well, that's not safe. Let's shut that down. And that is why we don't answer that email or like that thing that we've been dreaming about. We're like, I don't even want to look at it. Like if you've ever had that experience,
Oh,
that's
yeah.
that.
Oh, and I want to talk a little bit more about like the busyness and that like sense of I need to be doing more. I need to be doing more because I know this comes up a lot, especially in the early stages of business where you constantly feel like you're not doing enough and constantly feel like you have to be doing something, like anything. And then like what you said at the start, but it's all random things. It's not anything that's aligned with the vision. How do we get out of that cycle?
Yeah. So there's like a many ways to get out of it, but the one I teach people like on the most basic level, and this might seem too easy, but I think it's where I always encourage people to start, right? And that is to understand that when we're in that do more state, it's called a sympathetic. So that's the kind of fight or flight state, right? And in the simplest way, in that state, we have too much mobilizing energy. Your body wants to like fight a tiger. It wants to fight, it wants to run. That's what that state was created for. But there are no tigers. The tiger is your business, an email, a phone call, a conversation, right? And so you have all this mobilizing energy in your body. But for most of us, we're just sitting at a laptop. And so that's when that starts to become overwhelming and there's anxiety. And then we start the frantic doing. You start cleaning, you start organizing, you start going through emails, whatever like your thing is. But it's coming from the fact that you have too much energy in your body and nowhere for that energy to go. And it's coming out as anxiety. So in those moments, I encourage my clients to like notice that there's too much energy in your body, notice the frantic doing and get up and move that energy physically out of your body. Your body wants to fight something. As silly as that might sound, our bodies are still relatively primitive. And so the best thing you can do is get up, jump, shake, dance, go for a quick walk, but intentionally move energy out of your body before trying to come back and do anything strategic. Because by moving that energy, you're moving to a more regulated state. And then once you're in that regulated state, your executive functioning, the prefrontal cortex turns back on. And then you could come back and be like, okay, let me write out a to-do list. Let me think, what is my goal here? Which actions are aligned with the goal? And you could have that like broader vision. But in that moment, that is actually not accessible to you. No matter how hard you try, that part of your brain is just offline.
Mm. And that's so interesting because it's such a message that's drilled into us. Like, you got to hustle hard. If you're not hustling hard, you don't want it badly enough. Like, all of that, we hear it over and over and over again. And then I think that also creates this shame of, oh, I'm not doing enough. I should be doing more. What are your thoughts on that?
Oh my gosh, I have so many thoughts on this. I completely I completely understand the struggle, like I moved to California now. I grew up in New York, and honestly part of the reason I had to leave New York was because that it is the land of that like constant hustle. If you're not doing something, you're not doing anything.
Yeah.
And honestly, my take on that is just how inefficient that actually is. When you understand how the nervous system works and how the brain works, that is incredibly inefficient. There's just depreciating returns all the time. If you're constantly running on empty, if you're constantly trying to do from a dysregulated place, it's taking you a lot of energy to produce very little results. And if we just spent more of that energy on regulating ourselves, on taking care of ourselves, which, yeah, includes a lot of the basics, eating well, sleeping, getting rest, connection, all of these things that I think sometimes, I don't know, for me at least, early on in my business just went out the window.
Yeah.
Like even being a holistic health coach, I'm like, well, how else do you run a business? Like I just don't have time for anything.
Yeah.
Right? Because I was dysregulated. And so I think making time for those things will actually make you so much more efficient in the remaining time that you have, and will make your business so much more fulfilling. Not only more efficient and successful, but it will also make it so much more fulfilling, which makes it so much easier for you to keep going through the rough times.
Yeah, it's more sustainable, right? Because you're not going to burn out. Yeah. Oh, I love that.
Yes,
So,
exactly. It's a sustainability. Like that's exactly the word.
because I think like the approach that so many people have is like they do go hard and then they burn out. They'll give it 150%, but you can't give 150% every single day without something else falling apart, like the wheels literally falling off.
That's exactly it. And I think, then you get into those cycles of you hustle and then you burn out, and now you feel like you lose progress and you take 10 steps back, and now you have to hustle even harder because you feel like you have to make up for what was lost. And it's just like this endless cycle versus prioritizing taking care of yourself, going at a sustainable pace, and being more intentional with the direction that you're moving. It works so much better. But I think the nervous system getting dysregulated was what gets in the way. Like this sounds so logical now, but when you're in that state that we were just talking about, this all goes out the window and you're like, I just need to do whatever. And that's where I think it becomes a problem, where you don't call that out for what it is, dysregulation, and you just think, no, this is just how you run a business.
Yeah. And I think sometimes we can get into, I know my listeners get into this thought of, oh, well, the reason I'm not where I want to be in my business is because I'm not doing enough or I'm doing the wrong things. And I really like your take on how it can be your nervous system that's actually capping your success. It's not that you need to be doing more things. What are some of the signs that somebody's nervous system is the thing that's keeping them stuck where they are?
Yeah. So honestly, the signs will be kind of spread out in all categories, in that there will be signs that are physical. So, a
Mm.
lot of physical ailments, like we mentioned before, there will be mental, there will be emotional, there will be more spiritual, more in terms of like how you relate to yourself. But honestly, I think the one of the biggest things that we could be on the lookout for is honestly how we're speaking to ourselves, right? I think it's a lot of the times like a telltale sign of where our nervous system is at. And so when we're in a dysregulated state, our thoughts will mirror that. Kind of like, and I keep using these analogies because I think it's helpful for people to visualize it this way. But like if you were running from a tiger, in that same analogy I used before, it wouldn't make sense for you to have a lot of positive thoughts, right? You wouldn't be like, oh, everything's going to be great. I'm so lucky. I'm so grateful. You'd be like, run faster. What's wrong with you?
Yeah.
Go faster, right? And so when we're dysregulated, our thoughts reflect the state. Our story about ourselves, about the world, and specifically about our business, it's going to be a reflection of our state. So if we're dysregulated and we're in that, you're not doing enough sympathetic state that I mentioned, the story is going to be, you should be doing more. It's never enough. You're not good enough. Why do you think you should rest? Right? It's going to be very much like you should do more and you're not good enough.
Yeah.
Right? And everyone's out to get you and no one's on your side kind of feeling. And then if you're in that shut down state of immobilization, the story is like, this will never work out. It's never going to happen. Why even bother? Right. And I always encourage people to start looking at their thoughts and seeing like those kind of thoughts are a reflection of your state. Because if you're in that regulated state, it's not that suddenly everything is going to be amazing and perfect, but there's a sense of possibility. There's an ability to think long term. There is a sense of agency. There's a sense of, okay, this is hard, but maybe I need to make a plan. I could reach for support. I can get tools. I can get resources. When that disappears, we know we're getting dysregulated. And when we're dysregulated, the chances of us figuring out the next step disappear. They're just not, they're not there. So I would say that's a major one of like noticing those thoughts and remembering they're a reflection of your state. And if it feels hard to access, long-term thinking and hope and resources, it probably means you're dysregulated in that moment.
That makes so much sense. All right, Masha, I'm going to wrap up with one question that I ask all of my guests. And that is, when was the last time that you took imperfect action and what happened as a result?
Oh, what a good question.
I love
Oh my
to just
gosh, I
throw
have to
it.
think
Like,
about this
I
for a
really,
second.
I sometimes I'm like, oh, maybe I should tell the guests I'm going to ask them this before the interview. But then I'm like, no, I actually like giving it to you. And then you have to think of it on the spot.
Yeah, I actually do remember the last time because it was majorly triggering for my nervous system because the perfectionist in me totally came out. But I would say the last time I took imperfect action was actually with creating my group program. So the
Mm.
group program that I have going now was definitely the result of imperfect action. I think for the longest time I put off creating a group program because I was like, well, I don't know the exact thing I'm going to teach and I don't know how I'm going to cover everything. And I kept putting it off and kept putting it off. And eventually my business coach is like, you gotta practice what you preach. Like that's your perfectionism and you have to take imperfect action. And creating that whole program, I think has been a process and like really testing me to take consistent imperfect action. And it's been really cool and really rewarding because it's also allowed me to be a little bit more flexible and a little bit more open and a little bit more like, let's do this training and see how it's received. And then let's adjust versus thinking that I have to have like this perfect thing that I might have been working on for like 2 years in secret and then releasing it without having gotten any feedback from anyone.
Yeah.
Right. And then probably expecting some kind of great result, meanwhile, I probably would have needed to tweak it many times before getting any results. So ultimately, I actually think I got way better results doing it this way, but it definitely required so much imperfect
Oh,
action.
so much. And like any kind of creating any kind of program, course, like any of that, I always say like you're going to help so many more people if you get it out there imperfectly than if you're just sitting on the idea, like waiting for it to be perfect before you put it out there into the world. So I'm so glad that you shared that one. Where can our listeners go and find more about you? Where can they connect with you if they want to learn a little bit more?
Yeah, so they could find me probably the best ways on Instagram. On Instagram, I'm Masha Kay, Mashakay. I am on TikTok, but I'm not as active there. I'm Coach Masha Kay. And they could definitely check out my website, mashakay.com, where they could find my options for working with me.
Amazing. Thank you so much for sharing all of this. Like, this has been, I've learned so much. I know whoever is listening to this episode right now has been writing pages and pages of notes because I'm going to go and listen to this again and like scribble down a million things. So, thank you so much for sharing this with us.
Thank you so much for having me. I so enjoyed our conversation. I love talking about this. Thank you so much.